Why do we fall, sir? So that we can learn to pick ourselves up.
And I'm still waiting for Marvel to get back up, but that does not mean taking the easy way out. I've already stated this exact opinion many times before, and I'm aware that whatever opinion you hold isn't going to be swayed by this small-time video essay, but it needs to be stressed how much I don't want to see a recasted version of the original MCU team, or even a soft reboot. Naturally, the term reboot is fairly broad and could include just about any restarted narrative, whether that be through an in-universe plot device or a simple clean slate. And maybe if a rebooted Avengers team consisted of wholly new people, I would be more inclined to watch and enjoy that project for whatever it is, which could mean new characters we just haven't seen in live action or purely new creations written for the MCU. However, that is not the kind of reboot I'm talking about. There are exceptions, but on the whole, the reboot that fans want would mean the same property, same characters, just new faces portraying them. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and as many points as I bring up proving that Marvel's multiverse has been a failure, that doesn't change the fact that I'm still invested in its creative stories and new characters. I'm not even sure why people would call for a reboot, because that is the exact opposite solution to Marvel's problems, with that complicating the MCU more than it already is. It could potentially be simpler on paper, subtracting the many different worlds and characters, but general fans who aren't clued into every behind-the-scenes decision would have no idea why we'd be getting the same characters we saw in Phase 1. Now, I don't believe a reboot is actually in the cards, and I think Marvel would be crazy to do something like that, but with how many people that have been calling for it, I wanted to lay out the reasoning as to why that would be detrimental to the MCU. One of which is that it would simply be a step backwards, undoing everything that we've seen in the Infinity and Multiverse saga, and would force Marvel to start again at square one. People may be disappointed with Marvel's latest output, and I can understand the attraction to wanting a clean slate, but that would negate anything that they had taken the time to set up and would only further alienate the fans that feel broken down by confusing storylines. That, or as I just mentioned, confuse the fans who weren't aware that they were doing a reboot. It doesn't matter how phenomenal or how horrid these stories were set up, it only matters that they are there for the people to see, because the moment Marvel decides to officially abandon those, that's the day that they'll lose tons of fans and my optimistic outlook on their future, which takes a lot to collapse. And I won't deny that keeping up with Marvel's latest multiversal lore with anchor beings and incursions is exhausting, but what would be 10 times more exhausting would be trying to get myself invested in an entirely new team. Personally, I never want to see another version of Tony Stark or Steve Rogers. They got their decade of being in the spotlight and were given fitting closure by the end of a whole saga of interconnected movies that centered somewhat around them. And I could see Tony coming back for a minute as a holographic head, or maybe even as a younger Iron Lad. And I wouldn't be surprised if Steve came back as the old man leader of the free world that he was always meant to be, but none of those I want to see for an extended period of time. And I definitely don't want them to be mainstays, because when a variant is introduced nowadays, or at least when it's introduced well, it's for emotional weight directly linked to the protagonist. That or to be cannon fodder. And that's because as cool as it is to see a familiar face, I don't care about them. I care about the character we've been following in the narrative, not whatever new one a studio head is attempting to force down my throat. But that's not even the whole of it, because in the event of a reboot, that would mean that the entire Avengers team would have to be recast, making the transition even more abrasive for fans who loved the 2010s era of Marvel, because the new team we'd be given would just be generic knockoffs that absolutely no one wants. I put Tom Cruise and John Cena on the thumbnail as a joke, and I sincerely doubt that would ever actually happen, but you get the idea. Marvel would cast the biggest name possible for a specific character to guarantee even bigger profits. But with that character having already been at the forefront of the public's consciousness, those profits just won't be enough, because that audience has already seen some of that character's most iconic adventures unfold in spectacular blockbusters. I suppose with some rare characters there will always be an interesting story to tell with them, but even if those rebooted stories are incredibly well written and original, they'll still be unfairly compared to what we got, and won't ever be able to stand on their own right. And when thinking about a team like that, I'm reminded of the Avengers or Guardians of the Galaxy video games. If you put every other element about those games aside, it can't be denied that each character is a clearance rack edition of their live-action version. I guess you can say that out of all of them, Drax looked better than his movie counterpart just because he was finally able to be a bright right shade of green, but even he was directly tied into the more well-known interpretation, because that's the one people know and recognize. And just like those video game characters, any recasted Avenger will have that problem, whether it is intentional or not. No matter how much effort or how many steps are put into making a brand new Tony Stark variant, making it unique, more comic accurate, or whatever, it will always be compared to the one people remember most. I suppose it's safe to have recurring variations of the same character under the assumption that audiences are more willing to spend their money on a known property, but that is a very dangerous game to play, because that same audience happily watching one generic movie after the next will inevitably get bored. I feel like everything I have ever said about superhero movies can be summarized with this one quote about James Gunn commenting on superhero fatigue, which is, I think there is such a thing as superhero fatigue. I think it doesn't have anything to do with superheroes. It has to do with the kind of stories that get to be told. And if you lose your eye on the ball, which is character. We love Superman, we love Batman, we love Iron Man, because they're these incredible characters that we have in our hearts. And if it becomes just a bunch of nonsense on screen, it gets really boring. And I think Gunn couldn't have been more right, because so long as the filmmakers making these projects continue to strive to tell unique and fun stories, cliched and uninteresting superhero schlock won't exist. Though we all know there's always going to be some stinkers, just like how no matter what, there's always going to be some amazing ones. I don't want to see a reboot because that instantly sacrifices an original story. Nevertheless, those are the logical reasons as to why I don't want to see Marvel reboot. But really, it's just my monkey brain that doesn't like waiting and sees that reboot as deplorable. Frankly, this doesn't hold any water, more so my own dumb opinion that I don't even agree with all the time, but I am not a patient person. Having to start over and set up each Avenger in their own individual movie, taking a half a decade at minimum to effectively establish all of them before they've assembled is too much time. I don't want to go back to the era of disconnected movies that sometimes had an Easter egg from another film snuck in by the crew. That's the whole reason why people haven't been enjoying phases 4 and 5. Marvel should have moved past any kind of solo adventure or origin story, and though that's something they haven't necessarily followed, a reboot would focus solely on that. Or it would have an Avengers movie right out of the gate, which still would not be good, because that would be exceedingly difficult to write well even if the audience was already intimately familiar with all the characters in the teens ensemble. Though I suppose introducing a new team is easier than reestablishing a team of known characters, because the writers don't have to mess with any preconceived notion of who these characters are and where they've been. But either way, it just wouldn't work for an impatient person like me. And along those lines, I don't want Marvel to take a break either. Believe me, I understand wanting them to scale down production to focus on quality and not quantity, but it wasn't like quantity was their problem. Go watch this particular video of mine about Marvel's many characters that explains how their problem was the reluctance to clearly define all of these separate groups established within the multiverse saga. But personally, I was eating up the half-dozen projects coming out in a calendar year. Yet I can see why the majority of the audience does not want that. I'll always have an easier time trying to be the optimist, because usually I'm able to have fun watching a movie no matter what, able to see the effort behind any production even if it was half-assed. Hell, I'll use a clip of The Flash anytime I want to make fun of overused or ill-mannered cameos, but I still enjoyed it. And that's probably why I can look at Marvel's multiverse saga in a glass half full kind of way. However, no matter how bad the overarching story may seem, Marvel has still managed to give us enough good TV shows and movies that it's not hard to stay positive. I mean, there's a few of them that are genuinely bad, but on the whole, the worst thing that Marvel makes is still miles ahead of the worst Hollywood in general has to offer. Every Disney Plus show might have been bogged down by a cliched and generally bad finale, but I still loved each and every one of them overall. Not Secret Invasion though. Get out of here with that. And though we should have had at least a dozen by now, I'm a big fan of both special presentations, and I'm very excited for that to actually be utilized in the future. But that has more to do with the format in which we've been seeing these projects in, which does matter, but isn't as important when it comes to the stories themselves. So, in an effort to highlight exactly why Marvel's multiverse shouldn't be abandoned or rebooted, I interpreted everyone and everything we've gotten into 3 separate brackets. And I won't cover everything in extreme detail, but I'll try to discuss all of the key players, which are the magical world, the Avengers, and the cosmic side. And there's plenty of overlap, so I guess it's more of a Venn diagram, but you get what I mean. But let's start with number 1, the magical underbelly. because despite a lot of it probably being planned out, that's the side that we've seen the least of, like the Midnight Suns. I guarantee you that that team was already supposed to have formed in a special presentation or something, and just hasn't happened because Blade still doesn't have a director. We've gotten tons of characters that exist in the supernatural side of Marvel, characters such as Moon Knight, Elsa Bloodstone, the Black Knight, Man-Thing, and Werewolf by Night, who have all come up in some kind, but have all yet to return. And they don't technically have to, though I doubt Marvel has and ever will make a standalone story. Moon Knight hints at more, and I personally need to see more, but it could just stand on its own as a self-contained story. And the same goes for almost everything else. Werewolf by Night has the best chance for that to happen to it, yet I could also picture Marvel just leaving the mystical and supernatural side of their world for a future saga. Ironheart was supposed to come out in Phase 4, and she has nothing to do with this world, but her series was supposed to see her taking on the Hood, and diving at least somewhat into this magical world. Not sure she's dipped into it in the comics, but there definitely should be more stuff like that, where the hero is taking on someone who isn't just them but in a different color. But that doesn't really matter, because she's not going to be on the Midnight Suns. But if we are going to eventually get that team, I could see Doctor Strange or Blade leading them. And though she's got a long road of redemption ahead of her, I would also like to see Wanda as a member whenever she comes back. And with her, there are supposedly more than a few projects centering around her in development, but if abandoned, Wanda would be forced to stay in this narrative limbo. Dead but not really, childless but not really. But I'd especially like to see Wanda return, if only to see her actually reunite with her sons. I doubt that'll come up in Agatha all along. If anything, it'll just be a post-credit tease. But Agatha's show was also rumored to have a Kang involved, yet that definitely won't be the case. I'm not even sure what kind of witchy stuff will be introduced. At time of recording, I've only seen up to episode 3, and I have a review out for the 2-episode premiere if you're interested in my thoughts about this show specifically, but just know I've been loving it. Sadly though, I'm in the minority there, and if Agatha and her surrounding characters come back like I think some will, that will be yet another project that some people will have skipped out on and won't get the references to. References like Mephisto, or the teen who may or may not be Wiccan, which could be essential in the future, but might end up never being resolved, at least to any overarching narrative about witches, the Darkhold, and Wanda's reincarnated children, which leads to the second category, the Avengers. And since I just mentioned Wiccan, I'll start with the Young Avengers, lumping them and all the street-level heroes with the main team, just for simplicity's sake, even though they each deserve their own category. And the Young Avengers really are adjacent to the regular Avengers, but I still place them more on the lines of the street-level heroes, or even a Great Lakes Avengers if we ever get a team like that, just with more ground-level stakes. But on that team, I've heard rumors that Kate might be leading, and we've already seen Cassie, Eli, Billy, Tommy, America, and whatever Hulkling we're getting, and know that they'll each come together. But there are a bunch more Young Avenger characters that could come up in another project, or even be introduced in the Young Avengers movie or TV show. And then there's the street-level heroes, who've all been a member of the Avengers at one point and will no doubt join the roster officially by Secret Wars, but really, I just want to see them team up and fight Kingpin and whatever muscle he's hired, maybe even in some kind of Devil's Reign storyline. But in that, we've got Daredevil, who's getting his own show that I'm really looking forward to, Punisher, as well as all of the Netflix characters that have been folded in, and Echo, who got her own show that everyone has already forgotten. And like most of the Disney Plus shows, the finale felt off to the Hawkeye show, but I thought that still did a really good job of bringing in the Netflix side of the universe, to be precise, Kingpin, because we're still waiting for Netflix's Defenders team to be fully integrated in Daredevil Reborn. Not sure why Kingpin was shot in the head at the end of Hawkeye, because that just makes his character less believable. It's something that people have lived through, but for some reason, despite people in this fictional comic book world having survived much worse, I don't buy Fisk living through that for a second, even though the eye patch is drawn from the comics and objectively a good look. In any case, surprisingly, Echo of all things continued fleshing out Kingpin and set him up to be mayor of New York. Again, Devil's Reign? And of course, you'll notice that I'm bringing up Spider-Man now, and not with the Avengers. And him most of all bridges that gap, but he needs to stay street level. I'm looking at you, Spider-Man 4. I know we're officially not getting the Spider-Man Daredevil movie that we all wanted, but that doesn't mean the movie can't be smaller stakes. Who am I kidding? It's Sony, and multiversal cameo movies make all of the money, so clearly they're just gonna go for that. I could even see them bringing back Toby and Andrew, even though they should be relegated to a minute at most in Secret Wars. But in any case, it's time to move on to the actual team at the center of this category, the Avengers. And within that, if we're starting off in their release order, there's the show WandaVision, which manages to bring back Vision from the dead, even though he still isn't really back, and introduces the audience to Wanda's twins, Billy and Tommy. And of the many projects, this has that connective tissue I wanted and expected from their recent phases, with Darcy and Jimmy Woo playing a role, which is yet another failed aspect of Marvel's multiverse, that there needs to be more focus given to incidental characters. We needed a Coulson to bring together all of the people Phase 4 introduced, and I genuinely thought that was going to be Jimmy Woo when the multiverse saga started. And I may consider WandaVision a pretty good introduction to the ideas that would envelop every project in this saga, but it's clear that it was never supposed to be the opener. WandaVision could have been perfect as far as setting up the multiverse and more with teases like Quicksilver's, but instead turns it into a boner joke. And I could talk about that specifically for hours, but all I'll say is that Loki would have worked much better at launching the saga's overarching narrative. And on that topic, Black Widow being the first theatrical release, if you can even call its release a theatrical one, does not make any sense either. Putting aside the fact that it has nothing to do with the multiverse, it's a prequel, and when the movie takes place is when it should have come out, rather than leading a saga about multiversal incursions, but nah. Like I discussed in my first video about Marvel's failed multiverse, Black Widow, WandaVision, and plenty of other projects had been delayed and placed in release spots they absolutely do not belong, but that can't be changed now. Regardless, next up we have Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which honestly could have been skipped because we already knew Falcon was going to take on the mantle. He takes the shield at the end of Endgame, but is then retconned to have given it back to the military before his series began. If more was covered on the racial issues that it dips its toes into, I feel like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series would be better remembered in people's minds, but I personally still enjoyed seeing a handful of Captain America boys beat the crap out of each other and argue about propaganda. That series was mainly about establishing Sam and Bucky and where they were at, but it also introduced people like John Walker and Allegra de Fontaine, as well as giving us new locations like Madripoor, which I expected we'd see a whole bunch more of by now, but it was still awesome. Plus, the new status quo for Captain America and all of the surrounding characters with him was set up pretty well in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I remember being super high on that show just because at the time, I figured it was going to dovetail into Zemo leading the Thunderbolts and being Cap's nemesis of sorts, but nah. There's also more than a handful of dangling plot threads from Falcon and the Winter Soldier that have been up in the air without being addressed for too long. Some, like US Agent, we always knew would come back, despite having to wait double the time that we should have to see them again. But another that might never be brought up again is Sharon's Power Broker. The Power Broker and even Taskmaster both still have potential to be great ongoing lower level villains, training or giving power suits to other villains and sending them off on someone like Hawkeye or Spider-Man. But Marvel hasn't taken advantage of how those mini-boss-like antagonists could be another element of connective tissue. It's why I can't wait to see the Thunderbolts, but we'll put a pin in them for now. Because for the Avengers, either of the captains could lead the team, but I'm holding out hope Captain America steps into that role. Though another candidate for a leader in some form would be War Machine. He should have been an integral member of Phases 4 and 5, being a better liaison to the government than even Cap, and it looked like that was exactly what was going to be covered in Secret Invasion, or at least the first script of Secret Invasion before it was reshot to hell. But I'm not even going to get into that, because aside from Riri, War Machine is a great character to carry on Iron Man's aesthetic. I have no idea when Armor Wars is coming, if at all, but I'm also excited to see him possibly going after old Stark tech that has been stolen, and is now being used by crazy industrialists like Crimson Dynamo, Madame Mask, and Titanium Man. And I'm sure Vision will come back in Armor Wars too, but if you ask me, I just want to see Hammer come back as a smarmy businessman, maybe even with him being a little more competent this time around. And that doesn't really have anything to do with the big Avengers movies, but not everything has to. Not that that applies to the next Avenger, because Ant-Man, out of everyone, was chosen to truly introduce the main Kang variant as the multiverse's villain. Literally and metaphorically, Ant-Man and the Wasp are both much smaller scale characters, so that choice was clearly the wrong one, but having dealt with Kang, I'm sure Ant-Man and the Wasp would have had a lot more to do when fighting him alongside the Avengers. There's also Shang-Chi, who works well in the Avengers, the normal street level stuff, and the mystical side of the world. But with him, there's also the 10 Rings, now controlled by his sister, which has not been addressed at all since his movie. And there's even rumors that his sequel will feature a past Iron Fist, which would be cool to see, but would add to a roster that is far too long to begin with, especially when you consider that we're not even finished with the Avengers lineup. It's a bit of a bummer, but Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther was no doubt meant to be one of the key players in this saga, but that plan had to be changed. And Black Panther's sequel still managed to be fantastic in my eyes, because despite some bad CG, the story was still an amazing tribute to Boseman and introduced Namor. Surely we're going to see more of Shuri in the future, but when is M'Baku's challenge for the throne going to come around? Is he the king of Wakanda? I don't know. But let's move on to a happier subject, because while both Hulk and She-Hulk have their own thing going on, they are also on the team. And I have my theories on what Marvel is going to do with Hulk and his kid, but this video is long enough already, so I'll save that for another time. But we do know he helps out when he can. She-Hulk, on the other hand, looks to be the more proactive one, being a full-time lawyer and an official member of the Avengers team, going out on missions with them as confirmed by the writers of the next Avengers movie. I'd like to see a season 2 of her show, because frankly, that was the only thing fleshing out the day-to-day side of the Marvel universe, featuring a fun cast of sitcom side characters and a new superpowered lawsuit every episode as the B-plot. But I know that would upset the idiots in the fandom, and Disney has historically been weird in the way of catering to that small but very loud portion of the fans. Not that I even understand any of the hate for that show, though the one flaw that does make sense is how bad the CG looked in a few of the episodes halfway through the season. Yet even during those specifically, there was plenty that was good. The Magic episode? Wongers? How could you not enjoy that? I guess the Wrecking Crew could have been more comic inspired, if only for the fun of it, and could be seen as more villains that were wasted, but I just loved this shot right here of them flailing. Really summarizes everything that the live action versions of them are. And I may have already brought this point up, but if I'm honest, people like the Wrecking Crew or Leapfrog can and should return whenever the opportunity is there. Though with Leapfrog, I do wish we got the more innocent comic version. But now, it's time to move on to the final section of the Avengers bracket, the Thunderbolts. I may have talked about them plenty in some of my past videos, but recently, the trailer for this officially dropped, and I can confirm how good it looks. There's so many reasons as to why the Thunderbolts is a project that Marvel needed a few years ago at the least, but I'm still very excited to see Marvel's lower level and more incidental characters getting the spotlight. If I had to come up with a problem, it's that Taskmaster and Ghost both have the same white mask, and that Yelena and Bucky have the same haircut. But in all seriousness, I do wish Zemo or even Abomination was on the team, but meh. I'm reserving judgment for now. And then there's Sentry, who I will talk about in his own dedicated video closer to the lead up of the Thunderbolts release, but I refuse to spoil anything about him just yet on this channel. For now, all I'll say is I'm anticipating a lot of great stuff. Then, lastly, but certainly not least, third, the cosmic side. The category that has the most impact on Marvel's future. Wild concepts like an afterlife was brought up in Black Panther and Moon Knight, but Love and Thunder's Valhalla has the most chance of coming back, even though I doubt it will, with Heimdall and Jane's Mighty Thor most likely being gone for good. And I have many problems with Love and Thunder, but if you look to the couple different stories that inspired it, there should have been 3 different multiversal Thors teaming up to fight Gore and his god bomb, though there was already too much crammed into that movie. Maybe I wouldn't care either way if it was better. But it really bothered me how Marvel was introducing yet another aspect of the Marvel Universe with multiple different contrasting pantheons of gods, which could have been made simpler if Gore killed them all, but that wasn't what happened. They're all still out there. And as well as that, there's plenty of other plot lines on the cosmic side that will be left up in the air to be answered in a decade or so. Like Gaia, the most powerful being in the universe. She's the one character that I genuinely don't want to see again, but in a sense, she'll have to come back, right? But even without her, there's Thor's adoptive daughter who has the power of eternity, and Thor is rarely on Earth, being more aloof to humans' problems whether or not he's a parody of himself. But is his daughter going to be a character moving forward? Is she going to be in the Young Avengers? And Thor himself desperately needs yet another character rewrite. Not too self-serious, just not as much of a wacky comedy guy. Because his world and surrounding characters are interesting. People have just grown not to care about it because nothing emotionally matters for him. At least that was the case for his most recent outing. And as I mentioned before, Captain Marvel could lead the team, with her having found a newfound love for being a member of one, but she will at the very least be the team's heavy hitter. But up there in the stars as well, there is a Guardians team running around. But is it the one we saw in the end credits of Guardians 3? Probably. And the confirmation of Star-Lord returning confuses me even more. It's not like that would have been the perfect time to retire the character, because I do want to see him back among the Guardians. But that only complicates the Secret Wars narrative that will now have to find a way to rope Peter Quill into the fray, while also being respectful to the fitting closure he had by the end of the Guardians trilogy. I'd much rather just have Rocket and the next Guardian team being in the Avengers lineup, but Chris Pratt is still enough of a star that Disney will no doubt want to bring him in. And the next group is much more Earth-based than even Captain Marvel, but I guess you can include the Eternals in the cosmic category. They were introduced with a plan for an epic sequel, but that has been abandoned. So my biggest question, aside from what exactly the remaining Eternals are going to do in Doomsday and Secret Wars, is when and how Judgment Day will happen. Of all the storylines tossed up in the air, this is the one that cannot be abandoned, which is just infuriating when you consider that Marvel has already shown they will reference events that occur in the Eternals. So is Arishem going to be contemplating the decision on whether Earth is worthy or not for this whole time? Every day that goes by without that storyline being addressed takes one step further into Marvel's Judgment Day being turned into a joke, which really bums me out, because it can and should be an awesome story to see unfold. The comic version involves a war between the Eternals and the mutants, so I could see that whole storyline being saved for the mutant saga way down the line, but that would just mean that Marvel's decision to introduce the Eternals in Phase 4 would turn out to be one of the worst decisions in their cinematic universe. The Celestials had been seen beforehand, but having them featured and explained in a movie just brings up the question of what they're going to be doing in the events of Doomsday and Secret Wars. They could be written off, but after presumably doing the same thing with the Council of Kangs, I don't want to see all of these simultaneous plotlines that have been up in the air just be swept under the rug. It's lazy. Then there's Loki and the TVA, which could be capped off with the finale of Season 2 that places Loki at the center of the multiversal world tree, but out of everything, that plot point could make a great MacGuffin for Secret Wars, potentially replacing Molecule Man's narrative in the comic version of the story. And I'm sure there are plenty of individual agents at the TVA like Paradox with self-serving goals, but on the whole, the TVA seems to be much more peaceful than the all-pruning organization that they were when they were under the control of He Who Remains. Nevertheless, the TVA's knowledge of the sacred timeline and anchor beings will tie directly into the events of Doomsday and Secret Wars. How? I have no clue. And of course, wrapping up the many, many characters in the multiverse saga, or at least the ones we've seen currently, we got the Fantastic Four, who we all know will come from an alternate future 60s world. I'm beyond hyped to spend an entire movie's runtime within an MCU world parallel to the one that we've been following, though I can guess pretty confidently that that world will be eaten by Galactus by the end of that story, and the Fantastic Four will be forced to move to the mainline world, with RDJ's Doom following them and leading into Doomsday. And I feel safe expecting all of these storylines to stay up in the air until at least Secret Wars, but with a reboot, all of those would be completely and utterly discarded in favor of something else uninspired. And even if you aren't as optimistic as I am, I can't imagine a cynical solution like a reset would be a solution at all. I want to see all of these original and creative ideas put on the screen be expanded upon. Just think about what we can get further down the line. The Mutant Saga, the Cosmic Saga, a street-level team-up storyline like Devil's Reign, an Avengers, X-Men, and Eternals epic event like Judgment Day. There's so much I want to see that probably should have happened before the Multiverse Saga, but either way, none of that can happen if Marvel decides to reboot the same characters we've already seen. This saga could have used more incidental characters or villains, used as connective tissue between the three separate categories in the Multiverse Saga. And that could have been Jimmy Woo, just feature him whenever the chance comes up, or it could have come in the form of more team-ups. But none of that was done, or at least done well, because Marvel wanted to cash in, leading to overall mismanagement and lack of interest by the general audience. And I have yet to bring it up, but there's the likely option of a soft reboot, keeping the mainstay characters like Spider-Man and dropping the rest through some kind of narrative device. But that would be even worse than a full reboot, because I would constantly be thinking about the abandoned stories and people just out of reach that I desperately want to come back. I don't want any future that involves leaving all of these open-ended elements open-ended. It's lazy, repetitive, and only works to satisfy the same fanbase that has been catered to for literal decades. I'm begging you, Marvel, Kevin, whoever is listening, please don't reboot. Take a chance on the dozens of new characters that you have spent the past half a decade building up. Let that build-up actually come to a head in an event storyline that isn't just made to gratify a small portion of the fan base. And I could talk about this topic for hours, as you could probably tell, and I'll inevitably have much, much more to talk about, even with the specific topic of Marvel's failed multiverse, knowing I'll wake up one night and realize there was another subject I forgot to bring up entirely. But for now, this is the final episode in a 5-part series about this failed multiverse. So if you haven't seen those other videos, give them a watch if you're curious what other reasons I have to label Marvel's recent saga as a failure. But before concluding, I want to go back to the very start of the video, to the clip from one of the greatest thespians of our time, quoting something that I believe has relevance to just about any broad subject. Not this quote, though this is great. Obviously, I'm talking about Alfred's commentary on failure, because whether we want it to be or not, failure is a part of life. In fact, it's a part of success, a necessary step even. It may seem like Marvel should be making one perfect maneuver after another, and I would unmistakably prefer that, but trial and error is still a thing, even when it comes to massive Hollywood studios and multi-$100 million blockbusters. But being successful from here on out just involves looking at their failures, not ignoring them with a reboot. Are you hopeful that Marvel won't abandon the dozens of separate storylines that they have just for the sake of alleged clarity? Do you think that a reboot would be in their best interest? Drop a comment and let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. It would mean the world to me with just a simple like, but subscribe if you're interested in weekly video essays, reviews, and perhaps even a delicious sandwich.